Welcome, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. And it's thanks for coming out on this cold night. Please avail yourself of the food there, and don't be shy if you want to get up during the presentations and refill your plate. Please do. We've been thinking a lot about these issues and these environmental issues, along with thinking them in tandem with the Catholic Church. We had a major conference a year and a half ago on ecology in the church, and that's going to be coming out as a volume of essays called Fragile World, a term that's taken from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si about the fragility of the world that we're living in. And so we're really excited to have two speakers tonight to talk about one particular aspect of ecological concern, coal and global warming. And we've got two people that are not just thinkers about these questions, but are activists as well. So our first speaker is Michael Iafrate, who is a West Virginia native. He's getting a PhD right now from the University of Toronto, St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. And I think part of what he's doing tonight is drawing on his doctoral work. But he's well known in this field, and he probably would have gotten his doctorate a while ago had he not been working on the ground, as it were, in West Virginia in activism on precisely these issues. He's the co-coordinator of the Catholic Committee of Appalachia, and it's been a really influential committee, a group of people that has brought bishops together with priests, nuns, lay people, ordinary people on the ground. And he has produced, 40 years ago, they produced a very famous document called This Land is Home to Me, which came out under the auspices of the bishops of Appalachia, but was really kind of a cooperative effort. And 40 years later, in 2015, the same group, and with Michael as the lead author, has issued this kind of updated version called The Telling Takes Us Home, which expands beyond just environmental issues to talk about social and economic issues as well. There are copies of this available for a suggested donation of $10 in the back, but you can also read it online. Very interesting, and I think will be equally influential as This Land is Home to Me, that came out 40 years ago. And Michael is also a musician, so I don't know if he's going to do any music for us tonight. Our other speaker tonight is Father Edwin Gariguez from the Philippines, otherwise known as Father Edu. Also bridging these worlds of academics and activism. He has a PhD in anthropology, and he did his doctoral work on the spirituality of the indigenous people in the area of the Philippines that he works in, and the way that the spirituality can help us inform a kind of ethic of sustainability. He's also been leading up the Catholic bishops' efforts, the National Secretariat for Social Action under the bishops, and has really taken the lead in trying to oppose some of the more destructive environmental effects of mining in the Philippines. In 2009, he led an 11-day hunger strike against an open-pit nickel mine that eventually succeeded in their aims of protecting the environment. And in 2012, for that work and other work, he received the International Goldman Environmental Prize, which is given to grassroots leaders who do this kind of work, often at great personal risk. So we're really delighted to have Father Edu with us tonight as well. So please give both of our speakers a warm welcome.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to the center and everyone there, Karen and Francis, for the invitation and for the hospitality. Very excited to be here, and excited that it's not quite as cold as I anticipated. But really honored to be here to meet and talk with Father Edu and to learn from him. One of the points I'll make at the end of my talk is pointing out a tendency in the Appalachian region around these issues, a way of thinking that a lot of people call Appalachian exceptionalism, which what we mean by that is when people are thinking about coal mining and jobs and the politics of energy, there's a tendency to think that the problems in Appalachia are the most important, that they're unique. And I think that's a tendency in church circles too. And that's one reason I'm very excited to be here, to have this intercultural exchange and to learn from each other's experiences, because that's the only way that we'll move forward, really. I'll start with two stories from West Virginia that can perhaps provide reference points to begin to think about the relationship between Catholicism and coal in the Appalachian region. On Easter Monday, April 5th, 2010, an explosion rocked the Upper Big Branch mine in Moncoal, West Virginia, killing 29 coal miners. It was one of the worst mine accidents in recent history in West Virginia, and it was especially devastating, having taken place only 4 years after a similar explosion in Sago, West Virginia, which killed 12 miners. The following weekend, I attended Mass in Wheeling, West Virginia, where I now live, at one of the largest and wealthiest parishes in the state. In this highly charged atmosphere, the soft-spoken associate pastor gave a homily in which he recounted his childhood growing up in the coal fields of McDowell County, West Virginia, living with the daily fear that a family member would be hurt or killed on the job. At the end of the homily, the priest declared that those responsible for the explosion, the executives of Massey Energy, including CEO Don Blankenship, should be charged with murder. It was not long before this priest was transferred to another smaller parish, presumably where he could offend fewer Catholics at one time. The second story takes place shortly after the release of Laudato Si in 2015. Groups like ours, the Catholic Committee of Appalachia and others, were particularly excited about that letter, as many of us probably are. And in Appalachia, many of us were excited about the ways that the encyclical echoed many of the insights of our two previous pastoral letters from the Appalachian bishops, which I'll talk more about later. But some commentators have shown how other Catholics, especially church leaders in the United States, have downplayed the encyclical's message or even attempted to distort it, specifically in response to some of its more specific claims, such as the claim that use of, quote, highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay, end quote. West Virginia's Bishop Michael Bransfield seemed to downplay this section of the encyclical in a series of interviews following the release of the encyclical, stating that Francis's call for an end to fossil fuels is, quote, not economically feasible in West Virginia, end quote. In another interview, Bransfield promoted not ending fossil fuels, but the possibility of clean coal technology, saying, quote, coal is very important to the employment of our people. I think technological improvements of cleaning of coal can bring us to a point where we can use coal, end quote. His message to many of us seemed to be a kind of damage control to reassure West Virginians that there's no way the Pope could actually be talking about calling for a swift end to coal mining, or at least to assure the industry that it would not receive a very strong criticism from the West Virginia hierarchy. These two stories signal, I think, two tendencies in the Roman Catholic Church's historical relationship with coal, both in the industry and in coal culture, you might say, in Appalachia and perhaps beyond. One, a church that is comfortable with fossil fuels, and another that is not. The various stances that the church takes with regard to the coal industry are expressed today amidst an increasingly strong and unified global movement against coal and other fossil fuels, which continues to raise its head across the globe. After the election of Donald Trump, assisted at least in part by what some commentators call the rural vote, including voters in Appalachia, we continue to see how central issues of energy production are to the way our lives are organized and the possible future directions that lie before us in communities across the planet. Much of this newer attention to the coal mining politics of Appalachia is rooted in the very real apocalyptic reality of climate change, for which the burning of fossil fuels is largely to blame. But these issues, of course, are not new if you come from a place where coal mining has had a central place, not only in the economy, but also in the culture and imaginations of the people. A few years ago, I was visiting a Jesuit friend of mine in McDowell County, West Virginia, who served as the Catholic priest in the county, pastoring 3 or 4 parishes. Although I grew up in West Virginia, I had never been to this particular part of the state, deep in what has come to be called the coal fields. He was giving me a tour of the area as part of my research in writing the pastoral letter that Bill referred to in the introduction. He was introducing me to members of the community and sharing his own insights about the culture and political economy of the state. At one point on the tour, he gestured toward abandoned buildings and homes that spoke of the pain and trauma of joblessness and depopulation as a result of the collapse of the coal industry in McDowell County, noting that the spirit of the county was like being at a wake for a loved one. He also took me to his parishes, some of which perhaps have 10 people attending at a given Sunday Eucharist. One parish called Sacred Heart, which had just celebrated their 100th anniversary the year before. And for the occasion, the community commissioned a local artist who produced a sculpture of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, made out of coal dust. This curious piece of devotional art brought to the surface a number of theological and ecclesiological questions for me, some of which I'll return to at the end of this paper. But as he and I discussed this Sacred Heart of coal, my friend made the observation that the church would not be here in McDowell County if it weren't for coal. The church would not be here if it were not for coal. And he, of course, meant that as a historical fact, as the Catholic Church came to McDowell County and to many parts of Appalachia right along with the coal industry. But the comment struck me from an ecclesiological viewpoint as well. At what point does the claim, the church would not be here if it weren't for coal, become an ecclesiological expression which baptizes political and economic status quo and a constricted vision of history, meaning and future possibility of a place and the community that inhabits it? I left McDowell County aching inside, literally. It was an ache in response, yes, to the stories that I had heard and the landscapes that I had witnessed, but it was also an ache of a recognition of the complicated and in many ways problematic relationship that the church has had with coal in my home state. A relationship that could be characterized as an indebtedness to an industry that helped the church to spread through the region and has enabled the church to preserve its presence through the mountains into the present. Another day older and deeper in debt, perhaps. But there's also been a deep questioning of this relationship since the Catholic Church came into the mountain communities. And so for the rest of my time, I'll describe a few of the phases of this complicated relationship and then offer some current observations of that relationship for today. So again, that comment by my Jesuit friend is certainly historically true. Before 1850, only scattered communities of Roman Catholics existed in the mountains and were served by traveling diocesan and religious priests who ventured beyond the cities of the Northeast into the mountains. Compared to other Christian churches, Catholicism was late coming to the mountains, in part perhaps to what Lou McNeil describes as a prejudice on the part of elite Maryland Catholics against rural life, and a near-exclusive focus on the church as a uniform sacramental system to the neglect of the context in which the church is placed. After the U.S. Civil War, industry pushed westward, and by the end of the 19th century, railroads penetrated the mountains and coal and timber towns began to be constructed. Mainline churches, as opposed to churches within smaller mountain old-time Baptist traditions, became more prominent through the region in these coal towns, and were often called railroad churches because of how they popped up as industry expanded. Many of us are probably familiar, at least vaguely, with the company towns of the early 20th century in Appalachia, in which coal companies controlled nearly every facet of life in the coal camps, including the churches. That's something a lot of people don't know. Company churches and their ministers were paid for by the coal companies, and the hired preachers, as you might expect, stressed the importance of a strong work ethic, preached against unionization, and even sometimes served as mine guards and strike breakers during periods of labor unrest. Many miners attending these company churches quickly became alienated by the relentless anti-union messages, realizing that the preachers were, quote, selling us out to the bosses for a mere mess of porridge. Miners would talk back to the preachers or cause disruptions, and many simply left the company churches to hold services in their homes, or they joined independent mountain churches, leaving the company churches to management and the bosses. Other miners simply left organized religion altogether and transferred their religious convictions to the union, the UMWA. Not because they rejected Jesus or the Bible, but because, as David Corbin says, quote, they held Christianity dear enough not to make a sham of it, end quote. These are the dynamics into which the Catholic Church stepped as it expanded in multiple ways beginning in the late 19th century, as European immigrants, many of whom were Catholic, were recruited to work in the mines. Although Pope Leo's encyclical Rerum Novarum strongly affirmed the rights of workers, and although most Catholics at the time were working-class immigrants, Robert Craig identifies other factors which prevented Catholic leaders in the U.S. from supporting workers' movements. The diversity of ethnic groups, for example, made bishops concerned with maintaining Catholic unity. Emerging anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant prejudice led the bishops to take stances which proved that immigrants would not undermine American values, including capitalism. Finally, although immigrant working-class people were at the heart of the Church of the U.S., Craig argues that business elites maintained effective control of the Church and ensured that bishops remained sympathetic to the interests of industry, private property, and the myth of American success. By the early 20th century, West Virginia was home to some of the most dangerous mines and the highest death rates in the nation, as well as a diverse, immigrant, largely Catholic population. In this context, Catholicism and the coal industry were in many ways very much tied together. In 1907, the Monongah disaster occurred in which 2 mines collapsed, killing 365 men and boys. In response to tragedies like this one, the church was more comfortable playing a, quote, spiritual role of chaplain, performing the sacraments and conducting funerals like this mass funeral of 22 Catholic victims of the Benwood mine disaster of 1924 in Wheeling, West Virginia. Bishop John Kane in West Virginia is said to have shown concern for working conditions in private and worked behind the scenes to fight poor working conditions, but did not issue such support in public. Historian Chelsea Fitzwater argues that this silence is due in part to the financial influence coal companies exerted over Catholic churches. While Catholic churches were technically not company churches, in the sense that I described earlier, with ministers literally on the payroll, many Catholic churches in the region were built with coal money. Under the leadership of Patrick Donahue, Bishop of the Diocese of Wheeling, the diocese constructed a number of new churches funded by land donations or monetary loans from various coal companies. While there does not seem to be much evidence that the companies dictated the content of priest sermons, as in some of the company churches, agreements between the companies and the diocese stated that the church must make, quote, every effort to meet the reasonable expectations of the coal company and the spiritual care of its Catholic employees in exchange for the company's aid. Some loan agreements between the church and the companies established a relationship in which the company would deduct loan payments from the paychecks of Catholic miners, and such arrangements likely influenced the church to take a neutral position in struggles between labor and management. Beyond exerting mere economic leverage, however, during this period of U.S. history, coal was entangled with ideas of the theological destiny of the nation and of Euro-American colonization as a whole. As Barbara Fries narrates in her very fascinating book, Coal, A Human History, during this period of industrialization, coal was far more than just a fuel, but was seen as a divine and civilizing force, a gift from God Almighty which was to be the foundation of civilization. Coal, in short, she writes, quote, would raise up not only our civilizations, but our very souls. Coal would let us control the external forces of nature and control our own savage human nature too. Coal was our species' salvation, end quote. Faith, patriotism, and coal were very much part of a whole for Catholics too in the Appalachian region, an example of what Michael Baxter calls the merging of Catholic identity into American identity, as if there's absolutely no conflict between them. During World War I, Bishop Donahue made frequent public appearances at patriotic events in support of the war and in support of loyal civic responsibility, as did Bishop John Swint during World War II, who's pictured here. This was in part an effort to encourage immigrant Catholics to contribute to industry and to the war effort to show that they were real Americans. In West Virginia, that meant mining coal. In an appeal to Catholic miners during World War I, Bishop Donahue wrote, quote, I believe that in the providence of God, our beloved land is now the divinely appointed agent to keep the torch of liberty flaming brightly. The time is now to help your country. Every additional ton you dig will build a fire to burn despotism to ashes. On your shoulder rests a tremendous responsibility. The pick is as mighty as the sword. End quote. After World War I, efforts for unionization in West Virginia intensified, with priests and bishops continuing to take a pretty neutral stance. But this was not the only Catholic view in circulation, and more explicit voices on either side of the issue became more public. Many Italian Catholics, for example, participated in strikes in the effort for unionization, and as more Catholics did so, some priests like Father C.J. Kluser from the Morgantown area became outspoken opponents of socialism and unions. Father Kluser was widely published, and in one piece he wrote, quote, you want by all means a revolution. Well, you can have it. We are keeping our 6-shooters and Gatling guns in good trim, and we are ready to receive you. If we 15 million American Catholics are not able to shoot the heads off of 117,000 dues-paying socialists, we do not deserve to live. End quote. Eugene Debs and his brother Theodore were familiar with Father Kluser and his rhetoric and regarded him as, quote, a foul-mouthed priest, paid from the Wall Street fund that was raised to discredit socialists and socialism, end quote. At the very least, priests like Father Kluser were largely seen by the Catholic miners as part of a hierarchy that mostly sided with capitalist interests than with the workers. On the other side of the Catholic spectrum was probably the patron saint of Appalachian labor movements and beyond, Mother Jones. Born in Ireland around 1830, and after years of involvement in the labor movement, Mother Jones became an official organizer for the UMWA in 1900 and engaged in organizing in the West Virginia coal camps, meeting with miners, giving speeches, getting arrested, things like that. Mother Jones was Catholic until her death, though she drew on an alternative version of Christianity that bore more similarity to the working class Protestant theology of the unions. Mother Jones believed that Christian leaders betrayed Christ the rebel when the faith was used in the service of systems that oppress. She was fierce in her criticism of Catholic bishops and clergy who wined and dined with capitalists, including West Virginia's Bishop Donahue, who was the West Virginia governor's commission Donahue was the head of a West Virginia governor's commission that investigated the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strike. According to Mother Jones, Bishop Donahue's stance on the strike was shaped by his association with the coal barons, not the miners. And as a result, Donahue condemned the violence of the coal companies, but did not, therefore, back the miners' struggle for a union. Craig writes that Mother Jones viewed the world from the bottom up, with a faith in working people and in what they could create for themselves. And although her criticism of Catholic leaders' relationship to capitalism was similar to that of other labor figures, hers, he says, quote, was deeply embedded in a class reading of militant Christ and gospel, end quote. Other Catholic oppositional voices emerged during the Great Depression in the years following, as the coal industry saw dramatic ups and downs accompanied by poor working conditions and poverty. Dorothy Day, for example, discussed these conditions in her writings, including in the Catholic Worker newspaper, which have been traced by a scholar named Laura Michelle Diener. For Dorothy, mining was one of the worst manifestations of the disorders of capitalism. Dorothy Day wrote, quote, how can men love the darkness rather than the light? how can men choose such an occupation except they are forced into it, end quote. Dorothy, of course, as we know, believed work should be meaningful and respect the dignity of the person, nourishing both the individual and the community, farming being a prime example for her. And indeed, although discussion of the Catholic worker movement has largely focused on urban houses of hospitality, its full vision is captured best in Peter Morin's image of a green revolution that would combine both urban and rural dimensions. Mining, on the other hand, to Dorothy was an expression of a death-dealing industrial economy. Again, Dorothy writes, quote, "The entire industrial world has so little to offer, what with its cannibalism, its competition, that the men go back to their black holes and their 9 hours a day underground, 6 days a week, and begin to take pride in its hazards, its own unique miseries," end quote. Like Mother Jones, Dorothy was frustrated with the role that priests played in upholding the capitalist order, writing, quote, "They could give to the worker a philosophy of work right from the altar, day after day, and do their part in changing the face of the earth," end quote. Implied, of course, that they do not do that. Dorothy periodically wrote about her visits to Catholic worker farms in West Virginia, where she established a connection to the Appalachian region and its issues, along with a deep reverence for a way of life that is close to the land that would inspire later generations after Vatican II. I'm not showing you some pictures. There's Mother Jones. And Dorothy Day. On the table in front of her is a copy of the first edition of the pastoral letter, "This Land is Home to Me," that Bill referenced, which was printed on newsprint. After World War II and into the 70s, coal mining jobs declined due to increased mechanization and strip mining, giving rise to even more unemployment, low wages, and low living standards. By the late 1960s, a number of events and movements converged to introduce a change in perspective among Catholics with regard to coal and justice for workers, the people, and earth. The first influence here is the emergence of a new awareness of poverty in the United States as a whole and in the Appalachian region in particular, resulting in President Lyndon Johnson's announcement of a nationwide war on poverty. Secondly, a series of devastating floods in the coal fields of Kentucky and West Virginia inspired movements against the increasingly widespread practice of unregulated mechanized strip mining, the most famous perhaps being the Buffalo Creek disaster. Appalachian activists and academics began to explore the link between poverty and mining. Their critique of the political economy viewed the region as what they called an internal resource colony, or a national sacrifice zone, a region within a larger system whose resources and people are exploited for the sake of a national or global capitalist economy. Diverse local movements and organizations became deeply engaged in community development and political action, including the direct action of radical anti-mining groups. In most cases, these new movements went beyond earlier paternalistic Appalachian anti-poverty initiatives and were made up of local people who knew more intimately the problems they faced and the potential solutions. In the Catholic Church, Vatican II takes place at this time, of course, calling the Church to read the signs of the times and enter into the struggles of the human family for justice. After Vatican II, numerous sisters, priests, and lay people came to the region to serve, and diocesan leaders became involved in a number of initiatives, many of them ecumenical, and opened diocesan offices of justice and peace, and of Appalachian ministry. Bishop Joseph Hodges in West Virginia strongly supported these initiatives and listened closely to field workers, such as the two pictured here, who are two friends of mine, a little grayer now, because they were practicing new ways of ministering in the mountains. Women religious, such as the Glen Mary Sisters, were at the forefront of rethinking mission in Appalachia. They were founded as a missionary order to rural America, and the sisters eventually entered the coal fields to evangelize the poor. But in a kind of reverse evangelization, the sisters realized that they were the ones being converted by the people they had come to serve. And they came to see listening as the first step in ministering to the people. In doing so, they found new life in projects of activism, community building, and the arts. That's Sister Marie, former Sister Marie Cirillo there, who's also a friend of mine in Tennessee. The Catholic worker movement also took root in the region during this time. Pictured here is Chuck Smith, who founded with his partner Sandy Adams the Universal Gardens Catholic Worker in West Hamlin, West Virginia. Over 100 acres were put into a land trust, and community members grew their own food, raised animals, and participated in the movement against strip mining, publishing their own local Catholic worker paper called the Green Revolution, which was then later renamed the Mountain Worker. Finally, many Catholic ministers and activists had come under the influence of Latin American liberation theology through previous missionary experience in third world contexts, or were plugged into wider networks of Christians working for social transformation, and to intercultural networks such as the Theology in the Americas conference held in Detroit in 1975, which brought together theologians and activists from around the world. One of the probably first examples of what the Center does here. As Appalachian Catholic ministers and activists began to develop this new ministry of accompaniment, they began to desire a more unified Catholic presence and voice in the region. And out of their ecumenical involvements, a Catholic group spun off into a distinct organization called the Catholic Committee of Appalachia, uniting laity, women religious, priests, and bishops concerned about the region and its transformation. Members who had been active in the struggle against strip mining began to call the church to take a more public role in this issue. And the institution listened. Catholic worker Chuck Smith, for example, called on the Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston's Office of Appalachian Ministry to compose a statement condemning strip mining. "Who else but the church," he wrote, "is truly called to be the prophet, preaching repentance. Strip mining is morally wrong because it is literally destroying the land and its ability to sustain life," end quote. That Office of Appalachian Ministry did release a statement calling for the abolition of strip mining in 1972. And it gained a lot of media attention in a series of correspondence between Catholic cole officials and Bishop Hodges. And it raised to the surface differing opinions on the issue among Catholics. Hodges defended the statement but distanced himself from it, saying that it was merely the opinion of a diocesan office, valuable though it was. In a letter to the office director, Hodges wrote, quote, "We will have to establish some policy relating to public statements being released by diocesan offices or departments to the press," end quote. Eventually, CCA members began to desire a pastoral letter statement from the region's bishops. And so they started to make plans for that. Inspired by the Listen First approach of the former Glen Mary sisters, in the spring of 1973, CCA members started listening sessions with over 30 groups throughout Appalachia to hear the people's experience. Joe Holland, who was working at the time at the Center of Concern in Washington, D.C., drafted a pastoral letter gathering up the stories collected in the listening sessions, following the methodology of the pastoral circle used in the European Catholic Action Groups and in Latin American Liberation Theology, See, Judge, Act. And there was a deep sense among many members that an emphasis on action was especially needed in the Appalachian Church. So a separate action plan document was planned to be published as well. Drafts of the letter were composed and circulated to community members, activists, sisters, priests, bishops, and laity, and also industry people, who gave feedback in a remarkably collegial process in informing a local magisterial teaching. Representatives from the coal industry were naturally unhappy with the drafts that they read, because the letter described an economic system that values profit over people, and which maintains a stranglehold over the region, devastating the land and impoverishing the people. So the bishops agreed to meet with representatives from the industry about 2 months before the release of the letter. And the Catholic activists in the region feared there might be a last-minute coup to derail the pastoral. The bishops heard the industry out, but the letter retained its devastating critique of extractive industry and the ideology of the maximization of profit, which the bishops condemned as idolatry. So this is the pastoral letter as it was published February 1st, 1975. It's written in a poetic style of free verse rather than ecclesiastical prose, and printed on newsprint, drawing on stories from the people. The bishops insist that the Appalachian people, not the church, must lead the way for all of us, and that the people's alternative ways of living lives of simplicity and justice, so often repressed by the dominant culture, reveal within them the hidden voice of God who still cries out for life. The letter inspired various ministries, projects, and ecumenical relationships since it was released 40 years ago. But almost immediately after being published, the document raised debates in the Appalachian Church about action. issues which haven't gone away and really kind of tend to repeat themselves. I'm going to skip this part about a particular mind strike, but I may talk about it later in the question and answer period. But in 1995, a 20th anniversary pastoral letter, At Home in the Web of Life, was published using the same process of listening sessions and multiple drafts, describing a vision for the building of sustainable communities in Appalachia, an expression of integral ecology long before Laudato Si came out. So this idea of going back to the experience of the people and of the land and an ongoing discernment is something that's been really strong in the CCA tradition. Although CCA and its members have continued to do good prophetic work in the region since the release of At Home in the Web of Life, the organization has struggled through periods of internal tensions and the breakdown of cooperation with the region's bishops and diocesan structures. Certainly some of that might have to do with personality conflicts and organizational issues, but of course changes in the church are part of the story as well, as through the 1990s and beyond, papal and episcopal policies tended to return to a more centralized ecclesiology in response to the impulses of Vatican II, and became suspicious of ministries and projects that emphasized social justice. Global and regional events and movements during the last 2 decades have shifted as well. Of course, movements responding to climate change have arisen and become more strong and more visible, while new movements in Appalachia rose to confront new forms of surface mining like mountaintop removal, as you see here, and other forms of environmental injustice. These new movements are different than former ones in that they're often more radical. They're more connected with movements around the world. They're technologically savvy. They move past former binaries of insider and outsider, jobs versus environment, etc. And these movements have had an impact on Catholic activism as well. Although the focus of the Catholic hierarchy in Appalachia has been elsewhere, eco-justice efforts among the churches in Appalachia by grassroots groups continue. CCA, for example, issued a resolution calling for an end to mountaintop removal in 1998. During his time as executive director of CCA, Glen Mary priest, economist, and activist Father John Roush and others organized a liturgy of witness called the Cross in the Mountains at a mountaintop removal site in Kentucky, based on the traditional Catholic Stations of the Cross. The public prayer service invited participants to experience the crucifixion of Christ in creation while processing through the gaping physical wounds of the mine site, calling to mind the 500 or more mountains, 1.2 million acres of forest, and various species of non-human animal life that have been destroyed as a result of the practice. Even while opposing the destructive practices of the coal industry and a capitalist economy addicted to cheap energy, Roush and others are recognizing that the spiritual crisis within the story of coal mining in Appalachia includes the crisis that comes with the end of community and a way of life. This is why priests like Father Roush and West Virginia's Father Andy Schweitzer also engage the coal industry in ways that are sympathetic to the situation of miners. Catholic activists in the CCA mold tend to break apart the binary of labor versus environment, which is so prominent in political discourse. This is my friend Father Andy getting arrested at a protest. Bill mentioned the People's Pastoral that we published last year. I won't spend a lot of time on that, except to say that the CCA over the last 5 to 10 years started to ask themselves, when are we going to have another pastoral that updates our theological reflection for new times? And the idea that was discussed was the fact that it was not probably likely that the bishops of the region would sign a new document that maintained that prophetic critique. So we started to talk about the possibility of a people's pastoral, inspired by the centrality of the voices of the poor found in the original pastoral letters. And so in 2011, listening sessions and brainstorming meetings happened to start planning for this pastoral letter. The document, which, as Bill said, I was invited to draft, is titled "The Telling Takes Us Home, Taking Our Place in the Stories That Shape Us," and was released in December 2015, just a few months following Laudato Si. It lifts up diverse stories of Appalachian communities, including the voices of women, coalfield residents, miners, economically vulnerable people, people who are homeless, people of color, LGBT people, and the land itself. And although it doesn't have official bishop signatures, as we did not seek them, CCA believes that the People's Pastoral is in line with Pope Francis's vision of the Church, both in terms of its content and its method, as it stresses the importance of voices from below, especially when it comes to changing the world, which Pope Francis says over and over again. It's not the great leaders in our world, including church leaders, who make change. It's the people. Should I cut it now or just a couple more minutes? Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Just a comment about the response of official church institutions, which, like the days in the past, have maintained more or less a silence with regard to the truth about an industry that's often seen to be at the center of our problems. For example, officials from the Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston have stated publicly, and before I say this, a lot of people in the region suspect that finances have a lot to do with that still, just as in previous generations. For example, the Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston has said publicly that they draw money from unspecified fossil fuel investments. One of the 4 lay members of its finance council is a former lobbyist for the National Coal Association. And the diocese has accepted significant charitable gifts from none other than former Massey CEO Don Blankenship, who's now serving prison time for the Upper Big Branch disaster, as well as from a fellow named Jim Justice, who's a coal mine owner, now elected governor of West Virginia, who funded pretty much single-handedly a Catholic Charity Center in southern West Virginia. People have come to understand that people like Jim Justice and Don Blankenship give gifts like this to improve their community standing. So what do they get in return? Well, they get the Catholic Church's silence on an official level, at least. A spokesperson told me that the diocese opposes mountaintop removal and worker injustice, but that it does so quietly because banging a drum would not be prudent. These are his words. As Michael Buddy puts it with his usual directness, one cannot confront the rich and powerful with the demands of the gospel if one must court and comfort them as part of one's political strategy, end quote. Another comment is when Bishop Bransfield tried to explain further his comments about Laudato Si not being very applicable to West Virginia, he said, quote, "Obviously the dependency on fossil fuels must go down, but at the same time our consciousness of the unemployed and the poor must stay current and informed." So far, so good. He went on, "I'm not criticizing the government for wanting to get rid of fossil fuels, but how much of a price does Appalachia have to pay? The fact is, we're going to have to pay a higher price than the average person reading that encyclical," end quote. I feel, and I think a lot of people feel, that Bransfield's comments seem to show a very restricted sense of solidarity that privileges saving an industry that has arguably had a terrible impact on people and the environment. And when he speaks of Appalachia suffering more than other people and places, he exhibits the Appalachian exceptionalism that I mentioned before my presentation began. Certainly we must be in solidarity with people losing their jobs, but solidarity needs to be reciprocal. And Appalachian people must act in solidarity with those who have been excluded from discussions throughout the world. Skip here. There's a classic Cole song, "Dark as a Dungeon," which has some lyrics that go like this. I'm not going to sing. It's probably not possible at the moment. It goes like this. "I hope when I'm gone and the ages shall roll, my body will blacken and turn into coal. I'll look from the door of my heavenly home and pity the miner digging my bones. Where it's dark as a dungeon and damp as the dew, where danger is double and the pleasures are few, where rain never falls and the sun never shines, it's dark as a dungeon, way down in the mines." There's kind of a, even in this coal protest song, there's a presence of a kind of circle of life sentimentality. And perhaps in very restricted local uses, the ability to create energy out of decayed biotic material could be understood theologically as an illustration that all life is connected, that life comes from death, things like that. But with the rise of consumer capitalism, industrialization, and imperialism, the use of coal has become imbalanced and perverse, sitting right at the heart of what Pope Francis calls a killer economy. Coal-based energy, like all fossil fuel energy, literally requires death to bring good things to life. And death is dealt at every stage of the process, from mining, cleaning, transporting, waste disposal, and burning. It's become a perversion and a parody of the central Christian belief in the resurrection, the transformation of death into new life. But as Rebecca Solnit writes, the future is dark, and with the darkness as much of the womb as of the grave, or we could say as of a coal mine. And movements throughout Appalachia have learned to see hope in the darkness of the unknown of the world that is to come. In Appalachia, one of the false stories that we live by has coal at its very heart, expressed very well, I think, again to a maybe tragic degree, in the symbol of the living Sacred Heart of Jesus made out of coal, literally colonized by death. The image of the Sacred Heart is popular throughout Appalachia, including Appalachian mountain churches who believe that salvation means a change of heart from a heart that is hardened to a heart that is softened by others and by what's going on in the world, similar to what Pope Francis says about learning to turn the suffering into the world that we see into our own suffering. The inauguration of Donald Trump and his administration's imminent backward-looking agenda of nativism, climate change denial, and an America First energy plan is already placing obstacles in our path as we work toward deeper recognition of the sacredness of creation. This is the end here, I promise. We've been down similar roads before, but it is increasingly clear that the old maps will not do, and that everything must change. Pope Francis, in union with global movements for another world, prophetically recognizes that, quote, a strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety, for it is not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations while failing to question the logic which underlies present-day culture. In the past, as in the past, the Church of today will need to decide in every place where we find ourselves, in Appalachia, the Philippines, wherever, whether we'll continue to play chaplain to an unjust and destructive economy, offering prayers and charity for its victims while staying on the payroll, or whether we will accompany human communities, especially those who have been made poor, into the dark with hope. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to really sincerely thank the World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology of DePaul University for inviting me here to participate in this forum. I am sincerely happy to know that DePaul University is actively engaged in understanding ecological issues such as coal and the role of the Church in environmental campaign. Admittedly, the Church had been very slow, as in the story of Michael, and somehow ambivalent in responding to the ecological problems in the past. But now it has taken up the challenge of pursuing a transformative and ecological consciousness as we are holding the forum right now. It should be noted, however, that the Church's involvement in environmental issues did not start with Pope Francis Laudato Si. In fact, even during the time of Pope John Paul, it is already asserted that the prevailing situation of ecological crisis and widespread incidents of destruction of the environment are occasioned by a distorted value system and a kind of spirituality that lacks understanding of the sacredness of the earth. This is precisely the point of another forum that I attended in New York, Religion of the Earth Conference in UTS. For us in the Church, in the Catholic Church, and for the Protestants as well, We pursue our advocacy for sustainable ecology because we believe it is part of our Christian responsibility. Clearly, our Pope John Paul II explicitated that Christians in particular realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of our faith. The social teachings of the Church after Vatican II are replete with pastoral exhortations invoking for environmental stewardship, social and intergenerational justice, and the use of Earth's resources for common good and for authentic, people-centered development. The Church in the Philippines, as early as 1988, had already articulated the need and urgency for our faith to take on the ecological challenge. And this is the exact quotation from pastoral statement, what is happening to our beautiful land. This document was quoted actually by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. At this point in the history of our country, it is crucial that people motivated by religious faith develop a deep appreciation for the fragility of our island's life system and take steps to defend the earth. It is a matter of life and death. It is in this spirit that I stand before you today as we are challenged to come together as church to be in solidarity with the global community, to protect the planet, and to pursue our campaign for sustainable future. Our office, the office that I head, the National Secretariat for Social Action, also known as Caritas Philippines, is tasked to promote the agenda for integral development and ecological sustainability. The issue of coal mining and the operation of coal-fired power plants all over our country is causing alarming concern because of their harmful impacts to the environment, to health and livelihood of the communities. Our country actually is becoming more heavily dependent on coal, as largely in coal. According to the Department of Energy, the Philippines is largely a coal-consuming country, with the coal having the highest contribution to power generation mix of 44.5% in 2015. This is a total contradiction to the global consensus in Paris Climate Conference and the outright inconsistency with the commitment of the Philippines in its intended nationally determined contribution to cut 70% of its carbon emission. With the election of the new US President, we might be in the same predicament of not complying with the global agenda, as it was reported recently in his inauguration a few days ago, that President Trump is committed to doing away with the US Climate Action Plan. He is also pursuing a renewed emphasis in heavily polluting fossil fuels and a concerted effort to eliminate many of the previous administration's climate achievements. In the Philippines, there are already 19 existing coal-fired power plants operating across the country, but 39 more will be operational by the year 2020. 25 of these coal plants have been given environmental compliance certificates and are now operational or under construction. To support and sustain this number of coal power plants, an extensive coal extraction has to be put in place, and we have allowed to increase a total of around 118 coal mining projects by 2012, and most likely even more by this date. Many of the communities and dioceses in the Philippines have pronounced its strong opposition to coal mining because it will make our country contribute more to climate change, endanger ecosystems, as well as the health and lives of our people. This is in my hometown, for example. Parish protesters led by their pastors staged a protest against a proposed coal-fired power plant. And we need to walk the talk because we are protesting coal. They put up solar panels for the church. Similarly, in our neighboring province, Catholic priests garbed in their cassock, gathered together with their bishop, and they led the protest march against the construction of a new coal-powered plant within their diocese. The church opposed coal mining because of its harmful impacts to the communities. In Semirara Island in Antique, it's a small island province, the long-running coal mining project has led to immeasurable ecological destruction, including the destruction of hectares of mangroves due to clearing operations, land reclamation, dumping of infills and siltation, the buildup of toxic chemicals in surrounding waters. This has drastically affected a large number of its residents who rely on fishing and seaweed farming for food security and livelihood. Health problems have also been among the concerns of those who live nearby coal stockpiles, where mined coal is dumped to be hauled for later use or for export. An increase of cardiovascular and respiratory ailments, especially in children, have been reported in the residential community of Tondo in Manila. This is near my parish where I live. The recent encyclical of Pope Francis Laudato Si highlights the adverse impacts of coal on the poor and the most vulnerable. And this is already quoted by Michael in the previous talk. In Laudato Si, the Pope gives directive in what faith should mean in practice of environmental stewardship. Following the position of Laudato Si, there is absolutely no reason for the Philippines to be unable to execute unconditional mitigation actions. We are calling for a moratorium on all coal-fired power plants in the pipeline. This is a complete step to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Coal has been touted as the dirtiest climate-busting energy source in the world. That is why more and more of the international institutions globally have started the process of curbing its use, like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and many others. Even big private banks and financial institutions like the Norwegian Pension Fund, the Bank of America, to name a few, have divested away from this dirty energy. By the way, we lobbied before the stakeholders of Norwegian Pension Fund to divest from coal, and they did. Coal is not only dirty energy, but it's also an energy source that is slowly becoming unattractive and costly. Economists from across the world have expressed their concerns on still investing in coal, as it is now touted as a risky investment. And with all the energy transformation from coal to renewable is relevant to the US, I think, because the US is known to be the second carbon emitters, second only to China. In our collective voice against coal, ecological and climate justice advocates have asserted that renewable energy is needed to provide sustainability and security in solving the issues of energy access and availability. In our protest against dirty energy and to promote renewable energy, actually we filed a human rights case against the big polluters. I would like to reiterate the challenge for ecological conversion and energy policy as a way to protect and sustain our common home. This is our Pope's advocacy. The Pope in Laudato Si sends a powerful message to the nations and the world leaders whose actions due to date lag far behind the scale of response that is necessary. Laudato Si clearly affirms the need for urgent and collaborative action to avert the worsening ecological crisis. For us, for the faith-based groups and our governmental leaders, the challenge of Laudato Si is resounding very clearly, as articulated by our Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, who happens to be also the president of Caritas Internationalis, and I quote, "As Caritas and as members of the human family, we all have a role to play in this ecological revolution to which Pope Francis has invited us. We must strengthen the ties among our organizations and even our university and school institutions as well, so we work better together. By pooling our resources, sharing information, and supporting one another, we can show that it is possible for people of goodwill to restore hope together. Sorry. The voices of faith must be an indispensable part of our continuing struggle, of our continuing ecological, environmental campaigns, and in framing the agenda for collaborative action, not only for the church, but for the social movements as well. When I was awarded the Goldman Prize for grassroots environmental activism, I took the opportunity to re-echo the ethical perspective in looking at environmental crisis. And this is actually a synopsis of the Catholic social teachings. Protecting the rights of the poor must take precedence over corporate greed. Genuine development must prioritize the need to ensure ecological sustainability over market profitability. We should never sacrifice people and the environment for the short-term benefit of the few. Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Great, thank you, Father Edu and Michael. We have some time, about 25 minutes for discussion, so if Michael and Father Edu would come to the table in the front, and if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please come to the microphone here so everybody can hear and so that we can record it, because we always post our events online.
Thank you, gentlemen, Father, for your incredible expression of the dangers of coal mining. I worked for a Polish priest for 10 years whose father worked in the mines in Pennsylvania, and the stories of the mines were terrible. But what I'm seeing and hearing in what you're talking about is that the very root of all of it is the respect for human beings. If you're going to use human beings almost like they're animals, and if you're going to use human beings for economic gain with no respect for who they are, then it's possible for any kind of atrocity to take place, it seems to me. And tomorrow in Washington, D.C., there will be between 500,000 and 1 million people, many of them university and high school students, marching to defend innocent human life from abortion. This country has killed 58 million babies. Worldwide, the estimate is not exact, but 1 billion have been killed. So what I point to you is, whether it's mining, labor relations, farming, agriculture, water, reservoirs and disposition, if you don't have respect for human lives, if you can kill babies in the womb by the millions, is it reasonable to expect that a culture that can kill the innocent can respect the minor?
I think that was, is this on? Hello? Yeah. I think that's really beautifully put. Like, you're describing very well the Cardinal Bernardine's, I think, deep insight about the connectedness of all of these issues. I also think of one of the things we talk about in this pastoral letter, and Bill and I were discussing this earlier tonight before the event. One of the ways that elites try to divide movements and issues and disconnect them so we can't make sense of it is to divide things like respect for life and respect for the environment. I think of a lot of the movements in Appalachia against the abuses of the coal industry have been led not just today but historically by women. And women who, for example, Judy Bonds, people like that. whose main impetus in doing this activist work, they're getting into it not because they want to be activists. They're doing it because they're mothers with children, and they're bathing their children in orange water that's coming out of their pipes. They're breathing in coal dust. They're suffering from asthma. They're afraid when the mine site next to their house, when explosions go off. I think getting at stories like that, the stories of real people and the lives that are affected, that's a way that we connect these issues the best. Because I think you're right that what you said is at the heart of it, this respect for life.
For me, I think there's no problem with that. My office is under the Bishops' Conference, and as you know, we have a very strong campaign against abortion and even against reproductive health. But the point that we are always trying to make is that we need to be really consistent. If we pronounce ourselves to be pro-life, life of the unborn, we need to be also be consistent and defend the life of the already born. And this is the situation. Environmental, to be pro-life is also to be pro-environment. Because one important issue that we are also trying to do in the Philippines is to be Church of the Poor. And most of the people affected by mining are poor people in the poor community. So to be pro-life, we need also to be pro-poor. So the consistency of the church should be always practiced. This is no problem with that, Father. I fully agree.
Jobs. I think that the last campaign that we just had ended up being about people in places like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, not having the kinds of jobs that they need, especially seems to be in contrast with the environmental issues. They seem to be at loggerheads together. What kind of movements are afoot to bring jobs to the places? If you expect to get rid of coal, or coal is no longer a feasible way to live, what do we provide to the people who actually have been miners for generations?
A lot of people are proposing and enacting job retraining programs for miners in the coal fields, and it's taking a lot of different forms. Whether it's in the alternative energies fields, that's one where some connections can be made. There are initiatives in McDowell County, West Virginia, where I talked about quite a bit, where former miners are learning how to farm and grow food. My partner Jocelyn here is part of a urban farming group in Wheeling, West Virginia, which doesn't engage miners per se, but there are a lot of these groups starting throughout Appalachia, which is focused on food justice and how that's wrapped up in all of this, and the ways that we can look beyond the forms of livelihood that we've relied on in the past to not just do something different to make money, but to have a vocation that builds community and is healthy. So those are a couple of examples that I can put.
The Philippines is quite different from the US. We are an archipelago, many different islands ecology, and this is an agricultural economy. So the question of jobs is actually easy to respond to, because we already did a study, cost-benefit analysis. If you destroy island ecology, more people will lose their jobs actually. So what we are promoting as an alternative is to promote sustainable agriculture by trying to make land really productive. People can really get their livelihood. And this is a way very sustainable rather than doing mining.
Devin Linehan from this is not. Okay. Devin Linehan from the Emmaus House Catholic Worker, and I also work in the wind industry for a wind OEM. The economics of wind energy is that we are decreasing our price by 20% or 10% a year, and solar is decreasing their price by 20% a year. which, well, we celebrate that as somebody that promotes alternative energy, is really bad for jobs in coal areas. What I find curious about your two examples is West Virginia is an area that is recognizing that. My understanding is that they're recognizing that, and there actually aren't all that many jobs left in the coal industry, but they've largely gone. And I'm curious to culturally, how much of that loss, and I assume there's anger involved as well, how much of that is still a fear of future economic loss, seeing that they've already lost so much of it, versus a cultural loss. And in the case of the Philippines, I'm wondering, as that same march toward lower cost renewables that ultimately will outprice coal will reach the Philippines. Is there any recognition inside the Philippines that as you invest in this infrastructure, that ultimately, with or without climate change, it is not going to be economically feasible? And what does that mean sociologically to the people? Do they see that coming, and are they preparing for it? Thank you.
That is a good distinction, the loss of actual jobs versus the loss of maybe something cultural or a nostalgia, perhaps. I don't have statistics on it, but the number of coal jobs is far less than the media makes it out to be, or some of our church leaders make it out to be. The largest employer in West Virginia isn't the coal industry, it's Walmart. That's true. But as fewer and fewer coal jobs that there are, it still functions in the imagination of the people to such a strong extent that the way people vote, no matter if there's mining in their family, if they're personally a miner, they might come from a part of West Virginia, like I do, where there is no coal mining. It still motivates our imagination about what West Virginia is for, what it's about. We refer automatically, and I did it in my paper, the coal fields, as if it's a designation that God gave it. It's not, it's something we call it, because that's the value that some of us place on it. But I think that imagination is very powerful in West Virginia, and beyond West Virginia. If people who maybe are inclined politically one way or the other, they might be thinking of the poor coal miners in West Virginia when they go vote as part of their own economic philosophy or whatever. It's just part of the story that they're telling themselves, or that we tell ourselves as a country. So I think that's that's continuing, as we saw in the election. It's continuing to be a very powerful story for people in West Virginia. And I think you're absolutely right that it has more to do with the stories we're telling, and not necessarily completely factual statistically. And that's why we call this pastoral letter, The Telling Takes Us Home, taking our place in the stories that shape us, because we have been shaped by these stories about what West Virginia and Appalachia is for. And we need to rethink those stories and tell new ones about where we're from. We need to not call it the coal fields, maybe. Maybe that's not what is in God's plan for the mountains.
In our case, we have a double campaign side by side. On one hand, we campaign against coal, but on the other hand, we campaign for renewable energy. The argument before was that we can't go for renewables because they are expensive, but that actually is becoming more and more untrue, because we already did also a computation that with renewable energy we can even do better economically. And that's the thing. We are promoting solar energy, not very much a wind, because in the Philippines you almost have the sun almost every day. So it's really something that you need to harness. And but coal is still being promoted by the government, because mainly not so much because it's more cost efficient, but more for the corruption behind. But it's something that we need always to do. It's not more effective or more efficient, but it's cheap, and there's so much corruption going on.
So, bottom line is, what can we do? What are we going to do to get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of trying to improve things? Do we try to work through our government, through our church, all of the above? Where do we go to move things progressively forward?
Some of the things we're doing are in the last section of this, and with the See Judge Act method of writing theology or social teaching that I mentioned in the talk, usually the third section of action is very vague. You know, this is generally what the church should do based on these principles, but we don't want to get too specific. In the third part, we get really specific with things. We don't say this is what the church should do. We say these are some things that the church is doing. Solar co-ops and things like that. Focus on food justice. Retraining minors, and not marginalizing that very important part of the story and the solution. I think what we need to do is still emerging. I mean, we list a lot of examples. I tend to agree with Pope Francis that it's not going to come from, it's not going to come exclusively from people at the top and governments, but it'll come from a mixture of, global and national policies and communities on the ground. But I think any project that, in places like where I'm from, any project on the ground that is reimagining what it means to be human in this place in solidarity with others is on the right track, and that's really all we can do in moving forward. That probably doesn't satisfy you, but I think we're in a place where another line from the pastoral is that the good news about apocalypse and endings of stories and places and former ways of life is that beyond apocalypse is a new world. And that's something that I think is present in the scriptures that we believe in. We believe in a new heaven and a new earth. I'm a believer that small groups of people, where they live, in their communities, can do that to create a new heaven and a new earth.
That's the commonality that we have in the church, because even in the Philippines we also use that framework, the See Judge of the pastoral cycle. And I think there are, in the Latin, there are many concrete things that we can do, particularly the change of lifestyle and many other things besides. But I think for the church as an institution, I think we really need just to live our faith. What we need to do is really founded on our faith. This is not just an ideological activism, but it is the faith that does justice. And this is something that we need to harness from our own tradition.
So part of the difficulty with doing this at a university is that it sort of feeds into this idea that environmentalism is elitist, right? And this is part of this narrative that it seems like both of you are trying to combat. But it's a really powerful narrative that this is an elite sort of thing. I mean, in the case of developing nations like the Philippines, you hear the idea that this is, in order to develop, you need to rely on these same kind of fuels that the developing world or the developed world already made use of. And so it's elitist to tell developing countries that they can't resort to the same sort of things. And in the case of the U.S., I mean, we saw it in the election so very closely that the whole idea that is being instituted now, the gutting of the EPA, is based on this idea that this is a kind of elitist luxury. So how do you change the narrative? I mean, what do you say, for example, to the kind of blue-collar Trump voter for whom this issue is a kind of non-starter? How do you change that narrative of elitism in that case, and also in the case of this kind of contrast between developed and developing world?
Part of the way of breaking through that, I think, is getting to stories that everybody can relate to in the region. So no matter how somebody votes in West Virginia, maybe a Trump voter might hate the EPA and Obama taking away jobs and things like that. Someone who's kind of in that mindset was still pissed off when how many, 1 million people or something the water was poisoned in the Charleston, West Virginia area a couple years ago as a result of a chemical spill, which is of course chemicals that are connected to the washing of coal and all that. That came to light, of course. No matter how a person votes or thinks ideologically, those things still affect them. And there's a way into these issues through stories like that, I think. Because, even somebody who thinks that way, paints with a broad brush, so do activists when we, think, well, a Trump voter we're not going to get anywhere with these people. We have to get them, but get them through the sharing of stories and experiences where we all know that it's really screwed up that happened to people's water. We can't screw with people's water, right? There's certain things that we can all agree on, and I think that's the way we move forward, perhaps.
In environmental issue in the Philippines is not really bad because the most affected sectors and populations are the farmers, the business folks, and the poor people. So when they are the ones affected, this is really very much part of their lives. When their livelihoods are suffered, suffering people are really, it's not some conceptual argument or anything at all, but these are people. So it's very much part of their lives, much part of their reality.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody would like to.
Well, I'm kind of trying to understand what you said compared to what you said, and I'm not seeing it as elitist. I think what you're saying is corporate comes in and takes what it wants instead of letting the local people do what they want with their own land. Am I misunderstanding?
Come again.
The way I heard what you were saying was that corporate has come in and imposed its will on local people. Not that it's about elitists saying, oh, you shouldn't do this because it's not driven by the locals. It sounds like what you're saying is it's driven by corporate, not by local people.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And it's probably the same in the U.S. where it's driven by corporate interests. It's just that in the U.S. you've got a lot of the people that are suffering from it also on board, which is, part of what Thomas Frank is talking about with what's the matter with Kansas. Why do people vote against their own economic interests? And that's a peculiar problem in the United States.
I'd like to thank Father Edu and Michael both for sharing their stories and their insights tonight.